Liberty process.
This is an instructional disassembly and assembly video for the ADPL series progressing cavity pump. Before starting the disassembly of your Liberty Process pump, we recommend that you contact a Liberty Process representative if you have any questions. If the pump has been in service, we recommend you have flushed and drained the pump of all pump mediums and have a sturdy workbench on which to work. Tools required for the ADPL progressive cavity pump: pliers or vice grip pliers, two 10mm wrenches, a 3/32 inch Allen wrench, a small file punch and hammer, thread lock, a small flat-bladed screwdriver, small snap ring pliers, a heat gun, a vise mounted to a table or stand, and an arbor press or hydraulic press. Disassembly of the ADPL progressing cavity pump. Stator removal. Mount the pump in a vise by the support foot. If necessary, use a small torture heat gun to aid in the removing of the discharge adapter. When finished, unscrew it off the stator with pliers or vice grip pliers. Remove the stator from the pump casing by grabbing it with pliers or vice grip pliers, again applying heat if necessary. Suction casing removal. Flip the pump in the vise and remove the 4 casing bolts between the pump suction casing and pump bearing housing using a 10mm wrench. Remove the key from the keyway and the drive shaft using a small punch and hammer. Remove the 2 gland bolts from the suction casing also with a 10mm wrench. Pull the unbolted suction casing away from the pump bearing frame and remove. You should now have the rotating assembly fully exposed. Rotor, connecting rod, and mechanical seal removal. The pump rotor is removed from the connecting rod by first taking a small file and filing the exposed pin to remove the peen mark that holds it in place. Using the hammer and punch, drive the pin out of the rotor head. Be advised that removing the pin may make it unusable. You can now pull the rotor off the connecting rod. This will expose the connecting rod O-ring, which can now be removed and replaced. The mechanical seal can be removed from the shaft by first removing the seal spacer sleeve with a 3/22 Allen wrench. Once the mechanical seal is removed, you can slide the mechanical seal assembly and flinger ring off the drive shaft and replace as required. Again, use a hammer and punch to drive the pin out of the drive shaft. You can now pull the connecting rod away from the drive shaft. This will expose the other O-ring, which can now be removed and replaced. Inspect the connecting rod, drive pin, O-rings, rotor pin, and rotor head for wear and replace if required. Drive shaft assembly removal from the bearing housing. The drive shaft can now be removed from the pump bearing housing. Using snap ring pliers, remove the snap ring that holds the pump bearings in place in the pump bearing housing. Put the bearing housing in a hydraulic press and press the drive shaft assembly out of the bearing housing. Using an appropriate adapter, press the remaining bearing out of the housing. Bearing removal from the pump drive shaft. remove the bearing snap rings with snap ring pliers. Put the shaft bearing assembly in a hydraulic press with the shaft keyway facing upwards. Press the bearings off of the pump shaft. Only put pressure on the inner race of the bearing to prevent damaging the bearing. The ADPL series progressive cavity pump is now completely disassembled. Assembly of the ADPL progressive cavity pump. Stator installation into pump casing. Mount the pump suction casing in a vise vertically so that it is prepared for stator installation. Using sealant on the threads to prevent leakage, install the pump discharge adapter onto the stator, making sure that the side marked NPT is facing outward and the side marked RP is facing the stator. Apply sealant to the inside of the suction casing adapter and mount it onto the other end of the stator. Add more sealant to the outside of the casing adapter. Now mount the stator assembly into the casing using pliers or vice grip pliers. Rotating assembly. Install a snap ring onto the drive shaft into the snap ring groove that is farthest away from the shaft end with the keyway. Place a pump bearing onto the shaft and bring it over to the press. Place the drive shaft and bearing in a press so that you are keeping pressure on the inner race of the bearing. Press the shaft into the bearing just until it touches the snap ring. Be careful not to overpress the bearing as it will force the snap ring out of the groove. Remove the drive shaft from the press and install another snap ring into the groove on the other side of the bearing. Place the bearing frame on the workbench with the opening facing up. Start the second bearing into the opening by tapping lightly with a hammer or rubber mallet. Place the bearing frame and bearing into a press and use an appropriate adapter to keep pressure on the outer race of the bearing as it is pressed into the frame. Remove the frame from the press and add 2 spacers to the opening. Add the drive shaft, bearing side down, into the opening in the bearing frame. Now put the bearing frame assembly into a press with an adapter to keep pressure on the outer race of the bearing. Press the shaft assembly into the bearing frame until it seats, and you can see the snap ring groove in the bearing housing. Do not overpress, as it can crack the face of the bearing frame. Remove the bearing frame assembly from the press and install the snap ring that retains the bearings into the bearing housing. Connecting rod installation onto the drive shaft. Install the flinger ring onto the pump shaft. Slide the mechanical seal cover onto the shaft with the raised side facing away from the bearing frame. Now add the stationary face of the mechanical seal to the shaft with the white half facing up. Lubricate the shaft and carefully slide the mechanical seal assembly with rotating face onto the drive shaft. Be careful not to damage the rubber parts. Place both O-rings onto either side of the connecting rod. Apply some grease or lubricant onto one end of the connecting rod to lubricate the joint during usage. Push the connecting rod into the rotor until you feel the O-ring seat. Line up the holes of the connecting rod and rotor head. Lightly tap the connecting rod pin with a hammer to seat it into the hole in the rotor head and through the connecting rod until it is fully centered into the drive shaft. Use a hammer or ball peen hammer and put a peen mark on both ends to secure the pin in place. Using a 3/32 inch Allen wrench, add the set screw to the spacer a few threads to prepare it for future installation. Place the bearing housing in a vise to secure it while installing the connecting rod and rotor. Place the mechanical seal spacer sleeve onto the connecting rod in the orientation shown, then add grease to the connecting rod. Place the connecting rod into the drive shaft, making sure to line up the holes. Install the connecting rod pin to attach the connecting rod to the drive shaft. Now tighten the set screw to secure it to the shaft. It It is important that the set screw is tight so that the spacer does not come loose during usage and cause shaft seal leakage. The pump rotating assembly is now completely assembled. Final pump assembly. Secure the pump suction case assembly in a vise. Lubricate the inside of the casing and stator. Hold the rotating assembly and lubricate the flinger ring. While making sure that the stationary face of the mechanical seal stays seated in place in the spring, slide the rotating assembly into the case assembly until the bearing housing seats onto the case assembly. You will feel tension caused by the mechanical seal spring. Install the 4 10mm mounting bolts onto the pump suction casing bearing housing and tighten. Next, install 2 10mm mounting bolts and washers to fasten the mechanical seal cover onto the pump suction casing. Alternate tightening the screws in order to keep the seal cover level. You may need to use a small flat-bladed screwdriver to keep the mechanical seal seated in place. Install the key into the pump shaft keyway using a hammer. Turn the pump shaft with pliers or vice grips to be sure it turns freely. Your pump is now completely assembled and should be leak tested using water to check the seal for leakage. If no leaks are present, the pump can now be reinstalled into the pump system. Feel free to celebrate accordingly. If you have any questions about or require spare parts for the repair of your Liberty Process ADPL progressive cavity pump, please feel free to contact us at www.libertyprocess.com. We always have complete pumps and all spare parts in our inventory ready to ship the same day.